Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Delta Airlines Flight 2998 for Atlanta, Georgia. With the airline's continuous operations to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, all carry-on baggage should now be safely stored in an overhead bin. This procedure was implemented almost 10 years ago, when I was about 7 years old, because my family has always taken frequent trips. Even though I was only 7, I had already been in an airplane more times than I could count. In addition, I had grown rather familiar with the layout of our local airport, particularly this time. We arrived at our gate about 2 hours early. I recall waiting for about half of that time before I had to use the restroom. I told my parents this, and they were clearly aware that I knew how to navigate the airport, or at least enough to get to they let me use the restroom by myself. So I did. I walked 5 minutes to the main restrooms, which, it should be noted, were the only restrooms I was aware of. It was about 3 in the morning at the time, so I suppose that's when they cleaned them. I was 7 years old and not the finest decision maker, so I wandered aimlessly about the airport in search of another restroom to use, because they were totally roped off, indicating that they were closed. This took me to a hallway, which was separated from the rest of the airport. I believed I spotted a restroom sign near the end of the hallway, so I continued walking down it. However, about halfway down, I noticed a head peeking around a corner. A man was there. Without even thinking about it, I stopped in my tracks and said, Hey kid, come over here." I then proceeded down the corridor in the direction of this man, whom at the time I honestly assumed was an employee, and that he was going to. I not only trusted and believed him, but I was also thrilled at the prospect of assisting this man when he told me that he was lost and wanted me to follow him in order to help him locate the correct gate for his airline. He then directed me to a restroom where I could use the restroom, but no. As I mentioned earlier, I knew a fair amount about the airport, and I suppose the idea of being able to assist an adult made me feel special. I replied that I would assist him, but that I wanted to quickly inform my parents of what I was doing, not even as a precaution. I told the man I would be right back since I was excited and wanted to tell them. As I turned around and started to head back to my gate, he started yelling at me and telling me that we didn't have enough time because his plane was about to take off. Nevertheless, I replied that I would be quick. Shortly after leaving the hallway, I turned to check behind me and saw the man nearly rushing out of it and down the stairs that eventually led to the airport's exit. I thought it was strange, but I never mentioned it to my parents, and I almost forgot about it once I found a bathroom I could use. Fast forward to a few years ago, when I was discussing strange things we had gone through as children with some co-workers, and the memory just came back. It only took me a moment to grasp what had truly nearly happened, because I was much older. It was a very unsettling feeling to discover how dangerous I was years later, and looking back, I should have notified my parents about it immediately. Occurred, but I just hope the guy didn't try it on any other weaker children like me. I'm a college student, and since all of my money is obviously going to school, any additional money helps. As a result, this midterm, I chose to pick up or I work part-time my local airport as a ramp agent, which essentially means that I'm in charge of loading and unloading your plane's baggage. Occasionally, we have dead bodies transferred in cargo bins, and last night was one of those occasions. In addition, it was raining not just a little, but a lot, and there was some quite close lightning. Naturally, My manager gave me the task of pitching this plane. Basically, what throwing means is that I had to remove the plane's cargo from the storage container, since it was the last plane of the night, and there wasn't much cargo to unload. My co-worker Dave pulled the ramp to the plane and raised it up so I could go up the conveyor belt to enter the aircraft, even though I was already exhausted from school earlier that day. Storage container being the only person up there, I got into the small, claustrophobic area and made sure to sit as far away from the white cardboard box containing the dead body as possible. I attempted to move quickly since, really, all I was trying to do was get out. I was putting down parcels for about 5 minutes when I realized that there wasn't much I could do to speed things up. The conveyor belt we use moves really slowly, to give the workers on the floor time to scan each individual product. In addition to getting more frequent, lightning was also appearing to be directly overhead. I was attempting to ignore it with my earplugs in when I heard the loudest bang I had ever heard. It was lightning, but it was so close that I literally fell to the ground almost instantly. I quickly looked up, and in the darkness, I witnessed the most eerie image I had ever seen. The lid of the cargo bin with the dead body flying off, near the end of the plane's storage bin. In a complete fright, the body practically flipped from a lane posture to an upright one so violently that the lid flew off. I sprinted as quickly as I could down the ramp, while my co-workers yelled at me that the plane had just been struck by lightning we entered, and once I had calmed down, I told them what I had seen in the plane's storage bin. I will never forget how quickly the colour in their faces vanished, accompanied by horrified expressions. My manager finally decided it would be best if I just went home and there may be 5 minutes of talking about the matter and hearing how scared I was. I was in a state of shock the entire journey home, not knowing what to think. I wasn't sure whether what I saw was real or not, but soon after I came home, one of my co-workers texted me to tell me that the lid to the cargo bin containing the dead body was off when he went back up into the storage bin. So at least some of what I had seen was verified as real. However, because the dead corpse itself wasn't sitting up, I looked into whether a lightning strike release enough energy to make a dead body's muscles tense up so that it could sit up for a short while, but I was unable to find any results. Therefore, I'm still unsure if what I witnessed was caused by the lightning, a mental trick, or something else entirely. But in any case, I would resign from my position at the airport the next morning. I honestly no longer felt that the money was worth it because the pain I had gone through was so much more than the value of the money. I live in Portland, Oregon, but due to my work, I frequently find myself in a different city for my profession resembles that of an event manager, and as such, I frequently travel across the nation to attend various events. The firm I work for certainly pays for this. I occasionally work weekends or even weeks at a time for my tickets, but it seemed like I was always assigned to the cheapest route available, regardless of where I needed to go. I understand that the company was attempting to save money, but this frequently led to awful travel experiences, though I did meet some interesting people. Would be an understatement, but to be perfectly honest, I didn't mind at all, I suppose. I reasoned that, at the moment, when I was in the Dallas airport on a trip back to Oregon, the only thing that mattered was that I arrived at my destination unharmed. I had just finished working for the majority of the weekend on a Sunday night, and since I had to report to work on Monday morning, I was already fatigued, so I had to literally drag myself to my gate. My journey was really divided into 2 sections, so I would travel from Dallas to Sacramento, and then to Portland. The first flight wasn't too crowded. I was seated by the window, and there was only one other passenger in my row. This is something I definitely should have highlighted. It was a middle-aged man, and aside from his rather tattered and old clothes, he seemed relatively ordinary. However, who dresses nicely for a flight. We might engage in polite small talk for a short while, but in all honesty, I just wanted to lean against the wall and fall. As I mentioned before, I was so tired, so I took out my phone to watch something as I slept. Before I could even close my eyes, I saw the man staring at me over his shoulder. I honestly attempted to brush it off, thinking he was just trying to distract himself from my movie by staring out the window. However, a minute later, I heard the man mutter something like, "Oh great, just ignore me." This happened multiple times, but I persuaded myself that was simply misreading the man. But after a while I observed that he was writing furiously on a page and carrying a leather book. I kept looking at it out of habit and soon discovered that almost the entire page was made up of handwritten text, so tiny that I could hardly see them. I thought that I must have told him my name when we had been conversing earlier, because when I attempted to make out what he was writing, I discovered that he was writing about me. I attempted to make out more words, but when we finally touched down in Sacramento, people began disembarking from the plane. But the man seated next to me made it nearly hard for me to fall asleep because they were too small and too far away. He made absolutely no attempt to begin packing up his belongings, and when it was Aro's turn to get off, he did nothing except sit there with his head down, making the rows behind us begin to get off. At last, I stood up and explained the night. He continued, "I'm going to follow you. You're not leaving this airport alive," with his head down and his voice nearly whispering. I forced a laugh, believing he was kidding, but the man sounded serious. He had a connection flight to make. He stood up and let me go, but it was obvious as we walked off the plane that he really meant to follow me. My stroll grew into a jog, and as I looked over my shoulder, I saw that he had followed suit. After about 5 minutes, I arrived at the gate for my connecting flight, still with the man directly behind me. I tried to remain calm as I approached the counter and firmly emphasized that I had no idea who the man standing next to me was. They both chuckled, assuming I was kidding, but after observing the desperation in their eyes dimmed, and they reluctantly asked to check our boarding tickets. I gave them mine, but the person who had been following me also did so. The staff called a few times, and soon after, they instructed me to accompany them, and they brought me through before the man could follow us. I shut the boarding door. When the other passengers were finally allowed on, I was 10 minutes ahead of schedule. A woman sitting behind me inquired what had happened, so I quickly gave her the rundown. And that's when she responded, "Yeah, that guy had a complete and total freak out," she said. "He was screaming and nearly tearing his hair out the second you stepped on the plane, and cops were actually called to take him away." This truly appalled me and began to give me the impression that the man genuinely intended to murder me. It's obvious that the man had mental health issues, though I'm not sure because I haven't heard anything else about the circumstances. However, if that's the case, I simply hope that he gets the assistance he requires. Even though I've been an aircraft mechanic for Delta at DFW for about 8 years, the events of last October still make my hands shake. At the time, I was working the graveyard shift at Hangar 7, a huge maintenance facility located about 3 miles from the main terminal. It's one of those locations that feels totally disconnected from the outside world. Remainder of the world, particularly at night when it's just you, maybe one other tech, and rows of metal birds sleeping. I was 34 years old when I got divorced, and I must admit that I liked working night shifts because I didn't have to put up with management breathing down my neck. The first strange event occurred on a Tuesday night in early October. I recall, since I had just begun working on a 737,800 that came in, and the pay gap didn't hurt either. I was saving money to purchase a modest house in Arlington, and I was finally getting my life back on track. Rachel took everything in the settlement, around 2 a.m. with a malfunctioning hydraulic line. I placed my torque wrench on the tool cart next to the aircraft's nose gear and walked to the supply closet to get maybe 50 replacement O-rings. I spent 20 minutes searching for the wrench when I returned, checking under the plane in the wheel wells, and even asking Marcus, the other tech working that night, if he had borrowed it. He was clearly on the other side of the hangar working on an A320, though, and hadn't moved from his spot. The aircraft doors had been locked when I began my shift, and over the next few nights, things became increasingly strange. The overhead lights in Bay 3 would flicker and go out whenever I worked there, but the electricians discovered nothing wrong with the circuits. Eventually, they discovered the wrench sitting precisely in the middle of the pilot's seat in the cockpit. On the metal catwalks above, I would hear footsteps, but security sweeps were never successful. One night, while I was safety wiring a fuel pump, all of the work lights in the hangar went out at once, leaving the area completely dark for perhaps 30 seconds, just long enough for me to find the emergency flashlight. When the lights came back on, I began recording everything by taking pictures with my phone and recording times and dates in a small notebook I kept in my coveralls. At that point, the real issue began when all of the cowlings I had taken out of the engine were arranged in a perfect pyramid on the hangar floor. The bolts on a crucial flight control cable that I had secured the previous evening had been purposefully loosened and backed off to the point where they were barely hanging on when I arrived for work the following week. This wasn't a harmless error or prank, rather, it was sabotage that could have killed people. The following morning, my boss, Dale Morrison, called me into his office to ask why my name was on the maintenance log for work that wasn't done correctly. I showed him my pictures from the night before, which showed that I had talked everything to specification, but he just gave me a look like I knew he believed I was dishonest or inept based on the way he kept tapping his pen on the desk and making excuses. After that meeting with Dale, I began recording my finished work, time-stamped it, and everything, because I wasn't going to lose my job over it. The following nights were almost a calm, as if whoever was playing tricks on me was waiting for me to relax. Then, on Thursday, I was changing a worn-out brake assembly on a 757 when I heard the clear sound of an airplane door. I was all alone myself that night, so I grabbed my flashlight and began inspecting each jet, my pulse pounding so loudly that I could hear it echoing. Opening someplace in the hangar, not the main hangar doors, but a cabin door. That particular pneumatic hiss and clunk markers was off. I discovered it in the empty fuselages of the third plane I looked at, an A319 that was set to take off at 6 a.m. The emergency slide was still armed and the forward cabin door was wide open. Had attempted to leave, it would have deployed, resulting in tens of thousands of dollars in repairs and delays for the airline. However, that wasn't what left me feeling cold. Inside the cockpit, someone had pulled every single circuit breaker not at random. Either the auxiliary power unit, backup generators, and battery bus were the ones that would have completely failed the electrical system around 20 minutes into the trip. Whoever did this understood precisely what they were doing, and I notified security. Right away, Dale then took notes on everything. Security retrieved that night's tape as they were waiting for them to come, and what they discovered at 1:47 a.m. altered everything. For perhaps 3 seconds, there was a figure on camera. The strange thing was how they moved, almost gliding amongst the planes, never quite in full view of any cameras, knowing every blind spot every second. They were seconds tall, wearing what appeared to be our regular maintenance coveralls, but with the hood drawn up, entirely hiding their faces. The intruder managed to bypass the keycard checkpoints and the biometric scanner without setting off any alarms, according to Bryant, the security chief and a former Air Force member. Bryant asked me if I had noticed anyone following me recently or inquiring about my schedule. After watching the footage, Dale actually apologized, but I could tell he was shaken. The airline sent in their corporate security team, installed more cameras, changed all the access codes, and even offered to move me to day shift, but I partially declined. That's when it hit me that this wasn't random, and that someone was specifically targeting my shifts at work. I started carrying a heavy magic flashlight that doubles as a weapon because I needed the night differential pay, but more importantly, because I wanted to catch this person. Call it pride or stupidity, but I wasn't going to let some jerk ruin a job I'd worked so hard for. Marcus also started volunteering for more night shifts, but he claimed he didn't for a few nights. It seemed to work that we created a check-in system where we called each other every hour. Everything culminated on October 23rd, which I remember because it was my daughter Emma's birthday, and I had promised to video call her before her school day began. Approximately 3:30 a.m. discovered something strange about the cargo hold. When doing a normal maintenance on a 737 MAX, the access panel was slightly jarred, which I myself couldn't confirm all closures at the beginning of my shift. As I walked up with my flashlight, I noticed that someone had not only tampered with the cargo fire suppression system, but had also placed a device of some sort into the lines where my hands were. I was backing away to call security when I heard breathing behind me that wasn't normal, rather. It was ragged and almost excited. I shook as I took the picture, knowing that this wasn't just sabotage anymore, but terrorism. I turned around with my flashlight up and saw him standing perhaps 10 feet away. Average height, thin build, he was wearing hooded maintenance coveralls. But as soon as my light struck his face, I knew it was Kevin Lawson, a mechanic, who had been dismissed 6 months prior for failing a drug test. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils dilated, and he was grinning in a terrible, warped manner. Then it dawned on me that I had been the one who had realized he was high on the drug. "Hey Mitchell," he began in a voice that sounded like he had been yelling, "been wanting to talk to you about that report you filed. Work had alerted Dale to the safety issue. So Kevin took out what appeared to be a customized box cutter. The blade was much longer than usual. You cost me everything," he growled, moving closer. "My work, my benefits. My kids won't ever speak to me anymore." I anxiously believed my phone was on my work cart 50 feet away from the danger, so I began backing up in an attempt to keep space. Kevin must have heard me looking around, because he smiled when he heard the alarm on the wall behind him. "Go ahead and go. I know every inch of this building has been living in the ventilation system for weeks, watching you get used to your routine." And the idea of when Marcus materialized behind Kevin, a guardian angel with a huge torque multiplier wrench. Kevin must have known that he was crawling around above me all those nights. I tightened my grip on my Magit, trying to figure out if I could get to him before he did. Marcus was swinging the wrench when he began to spin, and it struck Kevin's shoulder with a horrible crunch, sending him tumbling. The box cutter skittered across the hangar floor, and while Marcus held the wrench up, I ran to the emergency alarm and ripped it off the hanger. Kevin attempted to flee as the area burst into sirens and flashing lights, but his arm was obviously broken. He began ranting about how we would all pay, how he had hidden additional devices, and how the airline had destroyed his life. Security arrived in a matter of minutes, followed by the police and then the FBI. In an abandoned section of the ventilation system, Kevin set up a makeshift camp. He had been planning this 4 months, living like a ghost in the infrastructure. They swept every aircraft and discovered 3 more devices, all of which were manufactured to cause Kevin is currently serving 25 to life in federal prison. I still work nights at Hangar 7, but now there are always at least 3 of us on shift, and security conducts hourly walkthroughs occasionally when I'm not there. He had catastrophic failures during flight, and the investigation found that he had been using stolen credentials from a janitor he'd befriended before his termination. I still hear phantom footsteps above me while working alone on an airplane. Marcus claims that I have PTSD, and perhaps he is correct, but I'd rather be paranoid than dead. The airline awarded me a promotion and a commendation, which ultimately allowed me to purchase that house in Arlington every night before I routinely check the vents and video call Emma to tell her I love her, because you never know when someone's past demons could surface. This happened back in 2018, when I was 26 years old and worked as a flight attendant for a large airline. I lived in a little. I had just landed a job after years of trying to get into the field, and although the pay wasn't great, I loved the travel benefits and getting to know new people every day. My route was mostly domestic from Chicago to New York, and occasionally Boston, nothing particularly exotic, but I remember feeling really proud wearing that before we even took off. Marcus was sitting in to be on a normal Tuesday morning flight from O'Hare to LaGuardia. Business class was full of the usual crowd of executives in their press suits tapping away on laptops, and I thought I had finally arrived at my destination in life. Purchased a black coffee with precisely 2 sugars and thanked me with a warm, sincere smile. What impressed me was that, unlike most passengers, he spoke directly to me. He had a salt and pepper beard and was dressed in a navy blazer that looked expensive but unobtrusive, like any other businessman. Over the course of the following few weeks, as I was traveling for work, Marcus became a regular on my flights, not all of them, but enough that I began to recognize him before I even looked at the manifest. He would always greet me by name, "Morning, Sarah," with that same warm smile, and inquire about how my day was going. He informed me that he worked in consulting and divided his time between offices. He would make small jokes about airport food, or ask for recommendations for restaurants in New York. I actually looked forward to seeing him on the passenger list when the shift began. Attendants build these small relationships with frequent flyers because it makes the job feel less robotic. Occurring so slowly that I nearly missed it one morning, perhaps 6 weeks after we first met, Marcus mentioned this small Thai restaurant in Atoria. "You'd love it, Pat," he said, adding nonchalantly, "It's probably walking distance from your neighborhood." I hadn't told him where I lived, only that I was based in New York. When I laughed it off and said that I lived in Queens, rather than Atoria, he swiftly rectified himself, adding, "Oh, I just assumed that since you mentioned that farmer's market, you go to the thing, is I had mentioned a farmer's market once." The fact that he remembered such a small information in passing weeks ago was emotional. Marcus' comments then became more detailed and intimate, asking about my cat Mochi. Although I couldn't recall ever stating that I had a cat when I posted, I asked him how he knew, and he simply chuckled and said he was good at reading people. He brought up a picture from my college reunion on Instagram, saying, "The next flight northwest, right, beautiful campus. Did you study communications there?" My profile was private, and we weren't connected on any social media. Things got worse during a particularly difficult week in November, when I was dealing with a death in the family. My grandmother had passed away and had taken a few days off, but I forced myself to smile and pour him coffee despite the fact that he said that I seemed like a Northwestern girl. When I returned to work, Marcus was on my first flight back when he grabbed me aside before I could begin the safety demonstration. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about your grandmother Margaret. She seemed like such a special woman that my blood turned to ice." I hadn't posted anything about her death online. "You mentioned she was sick last month, remember? And I saw the obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette online. I hope you don't mind," he replied, lightly touching my arm when I inquired how he knew, even though I hadn't given him her name, didn't have an address, but wanted to send flowers. Yes, I had discussed my grandmother's illness, but I went over every conversation I could recall having with him that night in my hotel room. Without knowing her identity or the area in which she resided, I began monitoring my social media accounts and making everything as secret as possible. I even Googled myself to see what information was there. And that's when I came across something in one of my old college. If you zoomed in enough, you could see my full name and hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, as well as my Northwestern student ID partially visible in photos that a friend had tagged me in. The real horror started during a layover in Chicago 2 weeks later, when I was staying at the airport Marriott, the same hotel, but I walked to the lobby to get a tea from the small market they had, and while I waited for the elevator to return, I noticed Marcus sitting in the lobby bar, browsing through his phone. The airline always made reservations for us at approximately 10 p.m. since many business travelers slept there. I assumed it was a coincidence, but when I caught his sight, he didn't seem shocked to see me. He lifted his glass a little, and a familiar smile appeared on his lips as he mouthed, "Hello, Sarah." I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that perhaps he had a meeting nearby, or that it was just a coincidence, but when I entered, the hotel restaurant for breakfast the following morning. I virtually rushed into the elevator and repeatedly pressed the shut button, was once more sitting by himself with a newspaper and coffee when he joyfully waved me over. "Sarah, what are the chances that you'll join me for breakfast?" I gently declined, stating that I needed to prepare for my departure, but he added something that made me feel really cold. He was right, the crew van timetable wasn't made public. I began recording everything after that, including every interaction and every remark that seemed too personal. 11:42 LaGuardia. Don't worry, you have plenty of time. The crew van doesn't leave until 10:15. Appeared in inappropriate places 3 times in December. During my layovers, I saw him at several hotels, always in public areas, and always with the convincing deniability of being just another visitor. He had learned my habits, such as going to the Starbucks near the Detroit once. I was strolling past a CVS in Manhattan when he passed by with his shopping bag in hand, looking shocked to bump into me. "Small world," he observed, referring to the airport where I would get coffee in the mornings and the yoga studio in Chicago, where I occasionally managed to fit in a session in between flights. The breaking point occurred during a red-eye flight from San Francisco. I wasn't supposed to be working that route. I had picked it up at the last minute when another attendant called in sick, but when I mentioned how surprised I was to see Marcus in his typical-to-be seat, it's funny how things work out, that I had to change my plans at the last minute. And that's when I realized he was somehow following me, he remarked. Later, a tech-savvy co-worker demonstrated to me, also mentioned flight tracking, apps that allow you to see crew changes in real time if you know where to look. Some frequent flyers apparently use these to request specific attendance. So I finally went to my supervisor, Lauren. These flight attendant fan forums are where people post about crew schedules and share photos. I sat in her office with my evidence, showing her the dates, times, and pictures I had taken of Marcus at several locations. She listened intently, nodding along, but I could see the skepticism seeping into her face. "Sarah, I know this is disturbing, she said slowly, but has he really done anything threatening, made any inappropriate advances, or touched you inappropriately?" When I said no, she sighed. "Look, he's a platinum member, flies with us almost weekly without concrete evidence of stalking or harassment in terms of legal definitions. There isn't much we can do. Perhaps he simply frequently visits the same places as you." That evening, I called my best friend Emma, a paralegal, and she validated my fears without using overt threats or physical violence, demonstrating that stalking was practically hard to prove. She said to obtain a restraining order and to change your routes if he escalated, but doing so would mean letting him win because I had spent years building my seniority. I spent hours searching online and found dozens of similar tales from flight attendants, bartenders, retail employees, and those in customer service positions who were confined by professional etiquette as someone gradually encroached on their lives. Culminated on a frigid January evening, though I had just concluded a long day of flights and was making my way from the subway to my apartment when I saw footprints in the snow that led to the entrance of my building and then veered off toward the alley next to it. Something prompted me to look closer, and I could just make out Marcus standing motionless with his phone held up and pointing toward my living room and the dim light between buildings window. But instead of running or hiding when I noticed him, he just lowered his phone, smiled politely at me, and left with a calm demeanor, as if he knew there would be no repercussions. I called the police right away, but by the time when I arrived, he had already left. The cops took my testimony, reviewed my paperwork, and emphasized that, in the absence of any witnesses or camera proof, it was my word against him. One officer, a woman my age, then pulled me aside and stated softly, "Between you and me, I placed a doorbell camera and to more inside my apartment that night, changed my social media names, and went absolutely quiet online. Guys like this know exactly how far they can push without crossing legal lines." Have you considered getting security cameras? Maybe staying with friends for a while, and began incessantly changing my routine. The next time I saw Marcus on a flight list, I called in sick, and I repeated the process often. After 3 weeks, Lauren brought me into her office, saying that the firm was worried about my attendance. Why she gave me the option to accept a transfer to international flights, a demotion that would cost me thousands of dollars in salary, or take an unpaid leave of absence to work things out. I chose the international routes for my first journey to London, and I spent the whole time searching, was hoping to see him in business class, but he hasn't been there for 6 months. Occasionally, I look at the passenger lists from my previous trips, and his name is still there as regularly as clockwork, Chicago to New York to Chicago. I wonder if another flight attendant, who is new and amiable, believes Marcus is just another lovely regular who hasn't noticed how he remembers every little detail, she says. The idea was straightforward. One final month of smooth flights free of drama and turbulence. The journey from Vegas to Phoenix was supposed to be one of the easiest, just an hour in the air, clear skies, low load, and no weather alerts, and I'd spent over 30 years in the cockpit. I'd done it so many times that I could almost do it without a blindfold, though I wouldn't. I was clearly not sentimental about flying, unlike some of the guys who kept journals or stole Polaroids from the cockpit. I simply liked the way things were organized, with checklists, schedules, and numbers that lined up predictably. That's probably why it was so difficult for me to accept what happened that night when it didn't line up. Following the guidelines, we left McCarran in a textbook fashion. Officer Denise Sharp, who was dependable, handled the most of the communications, while I kept an eye on the instruments and led the way out. It was late. At around 10:40 p.m., there were just 2 attendants, Eric and Lacey, and the cabin lights were lowered by the time we arrived. The majority of the 83 passengers had already fallen asleep with their earplugs in the tray tables. I remember Denise making a joke about retiring to Arizona being code for golfing yourself to death, and we both laughed. I felt at ease, which is unusual for me in mid-flight. About 20 minutes before descent, I noticed a faint flicker on the navigation display. Unusual at times, it's only slight interference, but then it flickered once more, and this time the entire lateral path changed for a brief moment. The screen showed us significantly off track, and a startling red line pointed us into southern restricted military airspace, which Denise didn't understand, and tapped the system to recalibrate. Right away, before she could finish, the screens fixed themselves, and everything appeared to be normal again. The autopilot hadn't disengaged, and there were no audible warnings, just a sudden detour, and right after the instant reset, I felt an odd pressure in my chest. We both double-checked our coordinates before a descent, but nothing had changed. We even requested ATC to confirm our position, and they said everything was good with no deviations or anomalies, yet the nav system glitched twice more. Every time it showed us veering off into that same off-limits airspace for perhaps a half second before correcting itself. It happened 3 times in the next 10 minutes. The communications glitched too much, crackling sharply but briefly. I had heard interference before, but this wasn't. There was a rhythm to it, almost like Morse code, but I couldn't figure it out. Denise didn't say much, but I could tell she was trying to keep her cool. Her jaw tightened when I urged her not to inform the cabin staff about it just yet, and we arrived at our final approach without any additional disruptions. The descent went well with no weather to hinder visibility, but I couldn't get the stress off my shoulders. My eyes kept darting to the panels, as if they were going to deceive me once more. When we landed, it was a clean landing with no. Several passengers gave a small cheer, as they do when they're relieved, but they didn't know why we taxied to the gate park shut down. If anyone saw anything odd, they didn't say anything. Denise glanced at me briefly as she gathered her bag, but there was only a brief, silent chuckle. I filed the maintenance log as usual, debating whether to include the glitch or not, but something about it kept bugging me, so I marked it under non-critical navigation irregularity. We agreed that something had been wrong up there, not broken, but wrong in a way we couldn't put our fingers on. Back in the crew lounge, reported it for engineering, to technicians examined it, and the following morning, they performed a standard diagnostics. Everything came back normal, with no indication of a fault. They dismissed it, blaming it on software lag and slight interference, the kinds of things they encounter frequently, but that rarely have any significance. However, I couldn't ignore the fact that the deviations had been so precise they weren't arbitrary, as if someone had picked that route. A few days later, I received a call from a member of the investigative team, who didn't sound concerned, but rather concentrated, and stated that they had examined the flight data and discovered anomalies in the communication logs during our descent indicate that there were intermittent signal interruptions that didn't correspond with anything normal for that route. They didn't see any internal issues, whether interference or equipment failures. Instead, they believed it came from the outside. He asked whether I knew any crew members or passengers who might have had access to any kind of unlawful communication equipment. I initially thought it sounded paranoid, but then he clarified that it was a directed signal that someone knew about. Precisely what they were doing. At that point, everything changed, and I began mentally reliving the flight, focusing on who boarded first, who appeared anxious, and who avoided eye contact. One of the flight attendants, Lacey, had asked me right before boarding, as this particular model of aircraft had a particular kind of relay box in the back galley. I recalled a man in 14A sitting rigidly with a leather duffel on his lap the entire time, and a woman near the back who never took off her sunglasses, not even at night. Didn't seem strange to me at the time, but why would she ask that? I wasn't sure what to think at first, and I wasn't just questioning a machine. I was questioning people I'd spent hours locked in the sky with. I didn't get much sleep that week, and every morning I would wake up thinking about those screen flickers and the static in my headset. I didn't tell my wife the whole story, just that there'd been a minor technical issue on the flight. She's heard enough flight talk over the years to know when I'm dismissing something, but even if I'd tried to explain it, I doubt she would have understood. It played back in my head like it had a message hidden inside. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't discovered it quickly enough, but the part that stuck with me the most was the possibility that someone might have been attempting to direct us somewhere specific, not just interfere, but redirect. A week later, I was called into a debriefing with two FAA officials, and a member of airline security confirmed that the disruptions weren't happened at random, but rather that someone had piggybacked onto the plane's navigational frequency for brief bursts, hiding the source. It was almost surgical. They inquired about the passenger manifest and the crew weather before boarding. They even looked over surveillance footage from the Vegas gate to see if anything strange had happened on the ground. I asked if they had any leads, but they simply thanked me for reporting the event and said the case would remain open internally. I ultimately filed for early leave a couple times. Weeks later, September was supposed to be my last flight, but after that night, I didn't want to go back up because something had changed in me. It wasn't just that I was afraid of something going wrong. I was afraid of not knowing who to trust, or whether the person grinning at you across the galley knew more than they should. Even though I've mentally rehearsed every possible scenario, I'll never be able to determine the true objective whether it was me or someone else on that plane. But I still think about that night every time I see a flight path on a screen, and unintentionally double-check it. That quiet guy with the duffel bag even planned to make it to Phoenix. The airline never made a public comment. There were no headlines or media leaks. Everything was buried like a system glitch. But I know what I saw and I know how I felt. Perhaps it's old habits, or perhaps I'm still looking for something I missed. Cockpit, when the systems drifted slightly south toward a location we weren't allowed to be, and I'm positive that whomever did it was monitoring us and was close. I work in technology, but not in the glamorous sense that most people imagine when they hear that I work with databases. I had never been to Europe, so I decided to take a last-minute flight to London because my company had closed a deal with a partner overseas and someone needed to fly out for a face-to-face handoff. Logistics companies are the kind of jobs that make your eyes blur from screens and your backache from office chairs that weren't made for actual human spines. In the hopes of surviving the time zone shift and getting some sleep, I packed light, grabbed my work laptop, and boarded the red-eye from Boston Logan with the belief that a complimentary trip across the Atlantic would help offset the jet lag and anxiety of preparing everything in 48 hours. The plane wasn't full. I was shocked to see that I had the entire economy row to myself, which was like winning the jackpot. A few rows behind me, on the left side, next to the back galley, an older man drew my wit away not because he did anything good, but because he looked his freshly ironed beige blazer, wire-rimmed glasses, and wrinkle-free button-up shirt made him look like someone you might see in a library advertisement. He was so out of place, especially since most people were half asleep on hoodies or neck pillows. A bit too formal for a crowded overnight flight. He sat quietly with his hands folded on his lap and a small leather bag beneath the seat in front of him. He didn't talk to anyone or play with the screen. We took off at approximately 9:45 p.m. and shortly after dinner service, the cabin lights went down. I tried watching something on the screen, but after 10 minutes, I gave up and curled up against the window with a blanket over my face. Sometime during the night, perhaps halfway through the flight, I woke up when I caught a glimpse of the man from a few rows back walking toward the restroom. As they brushed past me on their way to the back, he moved slowly but steadily, as if he had a destination and wasn't in a rush to get there. I remember thinking it was strange that he hadn't gotten up earlier, and that he didn't have anything with him, not even shoes, just socks and those stiff dress pants, and I fell back asleep for what felt like over 40 minutes. When I woke up, there was a vague tension in the cabin, not like in a horror movie, and the lights were still quiet, but a few people had begun to move. One of the attendants went by quietly checking in, and I saw her pause close to the back, before turning around and looking down the row where the man had been sitting. I sat up, experiencing that strange feeling that comes when you see someone else observing something. The attendant leaned toward the vacant seat. I didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps he had been in the restroom for a while and they were just checking. She looked down at the floor and even opened the overhead bin above. She whispered something into the intercom phone on the wall before walking off toward the galley with this stiffness in her posture that made me feel like I shouldn't be watching on him. But after 20 minutes or so, I saw two flight attendants standing close to the galley, where one of them was whispering and holding what appeared to be the passenger manifest. They kept looking down the aisle, then back at the paper, and finally one of them made her way lightly up the cabin. When she reached me, she knelt next to my seat and asked if I had seen the man in seat 41A get up during the flight. I told her that I had, and that I had seen him move toward the back perhaps an hour or so earlier. She gave me this courteous, tight-lipped nod and thanked me. She touched my shoulders and asked questions in a quiet manner. I didn't go into detail, but about half an hour before descent, the lights changed and the hustle and bustle of getting ready started. People were getting up, tray tables were locked, windows were adjusted. But there was this weird undercurrent now. It wasn't panic, but you could feel the male attendant was moving down the aisle with a flashlight, crouching here and there, as if double-checking something. I looked back toward the man's seat again, and his small leather bag was still there. Ripple, the attendants had stopped smiling and were having quiet conversations in the galley. When we landed in London, they said that everyone should be seated for a few more minutes because of a discrepancy in the manifest. That's not a problem. The blanket was tucked under the seat in front of it, folded nicely, and the tray table was upright. There was no indication that he would ever return. People began looking at one another and asking inquiries as a murmur that you hear every day spread across the cabin. I heard someone behind me mutter, "What the hell is going on?" while their seatmate whispered something about a medical emergency, but no paramedic board had been spotted. The crew appeared tense by that point, as if they had already received instructions they were not permitted to discuss. After 10 more minutes or so, they allowed us to disembark, but as I passed the back rows, I slowed down and took another look at the seats. At customs, we were gathered in small groups and asked questions. I was asked if I remembered anyone sitting next to me, if I had spoken to any strangers, and if I had noticed anything strange during the flight. For 1A was empty, spotless, and still had that leather bag untouched underneath it. When I reported that the man was getting up, the official took note, but he only nodded and scribbled. When I questioned if something had happened, he smiled tightly and replied, "Thanks for your cooperation." The man suddenly disappeared in mid-flight without anyone noticing him go or return, without any alarms, without any disturbances, and without leaving any trace. He had not changed seats or experienced any medical problems. That evening, I returned to the hotel. I couldn't sleep, so I started playing back everything in my mind, including his attire, his gait, and how composed he appeared. The more I considered it, the more I understood how odd it was that he had never glanced at anyone or engaged with anyone, and no flight attendant had ever checked on him. I even began to wonder if I had imagined him when he woke up and no one ever seemed to serve him dinner. However, I wasn't the only one who had seen him in an airport cafe. The following day, I ran into a woman from the same flight who had been sitting across the aisle from him. We ended up talking, and she swore a few weeks after I returned home, she recalled him waking up in the middle of the night too. He left his bag. She murmured softly, "Who goes to the bathroom on an international flight without taking a passport or meds or anything?" It wasn't just the airline looking into it at that point. Someone from a federal agency I won't name called me to confirm what I had said. They asked the same questions again in a more formal tone, but I could tell they were trying to rule out foul play or a security breach. This is the part that still chills me, though. I tried to make sense of it by looking through flight records and passenger incident reports, but there is no public record of anyone going missing on that flight, and there isn't even any indication of an investigation. It was scrubbed. I even made a request to the airline while posing as a journalist, and I received a response. "I know what I saw. I know the guy existed, and I'm not the only one who saw him," he added simply. "We have no information on a missing individual on the trip in question. If you go seeking now, it's like he was never on that plane. His name was included on the manifest, yeah, but it didn't match any passport logs from Boston or Heathrow Airport. CCTV. Only a name, a seat, and a missing man were recorded. I've flown maybe 5 times since, and each time I don't know what I saw that night, but I'm positive that whatever it was wasn't typical and wasn't meant to be. So, should I watch the aisle, count the heads, and search for someone who is too motionless, too quiet, or to cut off from the others? Observe that I think about him more than I should, because I'm afraid that something bad will happen to me. But I also wonder if anyone else has seen him vanish before. Perhaps this wasn't the first time, and I still occasionally check forums to see if anyone has posted anything comparable. I saw it happen, and I'm done acting like I didn't. So even if no one believes you, please tell something if you were on that flight or any other trip when someone simply vanished. I was flying all the time for work conferences, pitches, and client visits at one point, and I barely made it to the gate in time. I had just finished a presentation in Denver, and all I could think about was sleeping. I was also physically and mentally exhausted from carrying my suitcase through. All I cared about when I boarded was that 20C had all window seats that made me feel confined, and I liked having the freedom to get up when I wanted. It wasn't much, but it was one small comfort in a week that had been anything but a pleasant one. Terminals all week and already dreading the early morning meeting that awaited me in Washington, D.C. Just as I was ready to plug in my headphones, a tall, wiry man in his early 40s approached me. He was dressed like a businessman, but without the polished navy blazer and tie, and his hair was a little damp, as if he had just run through the airport. He glanced at my seat number before turning to face me and asking politely. I was hesitant to believe him, because I knew I wouldn't sleep between strangers, but he persisted and even offered to help me with my bag, if we could switch seats. He had the middle seat in the next row up, but he claimed to have a small bladder and needed easy access to the bathroom. The man in the window seat next to me snored like he had swallowed a chainsaw. And the middle seat wasn't just tight, it was confined to the point that I couldn't even cross my legs. I surrendered and regretted it almost instantly. I attempted to sleep, but every sound kept waking me up. I recall that at around 3 in the morning, the turbulence was not the shaky kind that jolts you for a few seconds and then passes, but I noticed the man I had switched seats with standing up not far from the front of the plane, whispering aggressively with me as the seat belt light blinked on and flight attendants hurried down the aisle to make sure the trays were correctly fastened. It was that longer rolling kind that makes you wonder how solid the air beneath you really is. There was a quiet argument between two flight attendants near the cockpit, but there was a noticeable tension in their posture. One of the attendants had her arms crossed and was constantly looking toward the cockpit door, while the other gestured quietly toward the man's seat, as though he should sit down again. I watched for a while, not sure if I was seeing this. He glanced back when he caught me staring and gave me this strange, thin-lipped smile, as if he was trying to hide it. I quickly turned away and tried to sleep, and the remainder of the flight felt longer than it should have. Went back to his seat, but I couldn't stop staring at the aisle out of the corner of my eye. It seemed like something hadn't settled, and every time someone got up to use the restroom, I tensed, half expecting another scene. The lights were dim, and most people were either asleep or trying to be asleep, but I couldn't stop replaying that time by the cockpit, wondering what they had been discussing so subtly, but urgently, and I couldn't get the flight attendant to stop staring at me when she passed by again, as if she was still nervous. We touched down at around 6 in the morning. Even though we still had 10 minutes to wait, I stayed seated as usual, letting the crowd thin before grabbing my bag, but the plane didn't open right away, and a voice spoke up. I'm in Dallas at that groggy hour when everything feels hazy and rushed. People were nervous just because the intercom was quiet, but practiced and asked everyone to be seated while the situation was being handled. I recall hearing a woman behind Emmy mumble, "That can't be good." 3 federal agents, not TSA or airport employees, wearing dark jackets with modest official lettering, boarded while her child kicked the back of my seat. No one moved. It seemed as though the entire front of the plane held its breath as they proceeded down the aisle without hesitation, halted exactly where I had been seated at 20 to C, and gave the man who was sitting there, the same guy who had sought to trade places with me, a stern order to rise up. He appeared to be very composed. The woman in the window seat next to him was utterly astonished, her face as white as chalk. He stood, straightened his blazer, and followed them off the plane as if he had been expecting it. There wasn't much conversation during the few minutes before the rest of us were permitted to disembark. Instead, there was a calm flow of passengers leaving, some of whom were looking forward as if they thought there would be more agents waiting. I remained silent until I reached the terminal, at which point the same flight attendant who had been arguing with him pulled. I told her everything, word for word, and she nodded slowly before carefully explaining that there had been something concealed beneath my original seat, something so significant that the man had asked me if I knew what he had said to me or why he had wanted my seat. She would only state that the airline was working with federal investigators, but the way she looked at me, there seemed to be a weight behind her eyes, as if she knew I was unaware of how near I had come to being involved in something I never would have left behind, trying to piece everything together. I spent some time wandering the airport at my hotel, I kept playing back the scene where he asked to move seats. How casual it had been. How simple it had been to say yes. And now I couldn't help wondering what would have happened if I had stayed into to see. Instead of arresting me, would I have been held, interrogated, and forced into something I didn't understand? I began to spiral out of control, picturing headlines and my name being linked to something I hadn't done. It terrified me how quickly things could have gone wrong over a simple, courteous favor later that I couldn't sleep that night. So I looked through Twitter, local channels, news alerts, and everything else, but there was no mention of a man being arrested on a flight, and the airline didn't make a statement. The following day, I even called customer service, feigning to have left something under. The representative simply apologized and stated that the item had been confiscated for safety concerns and that no other information could be provided. The phrase confiscated struck a different chord because it wasn't lost or turned in. Rather, it was removed to this day. The representative was checking the seat to see if they would say anything. What really upset me was the notion that he purposefully picked me to take his seat. I'm not sure if it was drugs, a weapon, or something worse. He needed someone who looked ordinary, forgettable, and exhausted enough to consent to a last-minute switch without. I was ideal for that question, and he likely looked around the gate before focusing on me, because I appeared to be just trying to fall asleep and blend in. He was correct, and ever since then, I haven't flown without thinking about that night. I still take all seats whenever I can, but I never ever switch, even if whether someone has a broken leg or a sob story. I maintain my position regardless of whether it makes me seem harsh. Since that night on a packed plane, one courteous choice nearly made me a suspect, or worse, a pawn. I left that trip believing I was simply fortunate, but now that I think about it, perhaps I wasn't. Perhaps I was the one who said yes too quickly. That winter, I was operating regional flights out of Minneapolis, primarily short hops to smaller airports throughout the hour. Final journey was supposed to be simple, that evening just a brief hop to a peaceful airport in rural Wisconsin and back, but the snow came in quickly and heavily, the kind that sticks to windows and sheets and makes runways disappear as if they never existed. Along with the two other crew members, was flying with Kevin, our younger flight tech, who spoke too quickly when he was anxious, and Elise, my roommate during layovers, and perhaps the most unwavering person I know air traffic control had grounded everything when we landed, so there were no flights coming in or going out. We were stuck until morning. I saw bare bones, a single terminal with dim lighting and rows of empty metal chairs, vending machines in the corner, and one of those antiquated public address systems that crackled every hour to remind everyone that the airport was smaller than most bus stops, that the terminal was closing. The ground crew had already departed by the time we got off the plane, and the cleaning crew was just finishing up when a janitor, who might have been in his 60s, gave us a courteous nod before leaving. He said something about locking up behind him, and Elise laughed. It appears that we have the area to ourselves at the moment, which didn't seem like a terrible thing. The three of us had done this type of thing before, sleeping in strange places during unexpected overnight weather delays, and we set up camp near the gates using airline blankets and the thin pillows that travelers always moan about. Around 1 a.m., Elise was browsing through her phone and Kevin was attempting to sleep across a row of seats, so I took advantage of the opportunity to go to the bathroom. I stood there for a while after realizing that the first thing that didn't make sense was that the hallway lights had been turned down, but you could still see the sheen on the mopped floor where someone had walked through it, leaving clear prints that led into the staff-only corridor. I almost considered waking Elise, but I restrained myself because we were locked in, so perhaps the janitor was responsible. I was peering down the hallway as if the floor were playing tricks on me, but the tracks were fresh, not muddy from outside, just outlined from someone walking across drying cleaner. Perhaps he had forgotten to set the alarm, but it was late. I was exhausted, and I didn't want to come across as suspicious, so I kept looking over my shoulder as I made my way back, reminding myself not to be strange. When I noticed the supply closet next to I pushed the closet door open with the tip of my shoe, half expecting to see a mop bucket or some folded towels, but instead I saw that it was completely dark inside with no light switch, so I stood there listening to nothing. The vending machines were cracked open, and I could have sworn they had been closed earlier. I don't know how to explain it, but it smelled strange, like old water mixed with something metallic. It was stale, not overpowering, and when I returned, I closed the door without checking further. Elise had her earplugs flipping, and Kevin was unconscious as they arrived at the gate area, like she was waiting at a hairdresser. I told her through a tabloid magazine, without bringing up the closet or the footprints. For me, it wasn't a huge concern, because I must have fallen asleep at some time. Around 3:30 a.m., it was more like a succession of flickers in and out than profound slumber. I am suddenly, somewhere deep down the terminal, I awakened up with a gentle noise, like a door slamming, and I sat up, blinking toward the far end, but no one was there. The lights had dimmed, and everything had Elise no longer had that unsettling blue-grey tint from the emergency lighting. Kevin was not moving, but the blanket and bag next to it was still there. Where did Elise go? He asked, rubbing his eyes in confusion. I was half asleep when he asked, so I wasn't sure. We waited for perhaps 5 minutes, assuming she had simply gone to the restroom or wandered off to stretch her legs, but Elise wasn't the kind to vanish in silence, so something felt off. I walked inspecting the facilities and even banging on the office doors behind the ticket counters, but nothing came up. The strangest thing about the closet I'd seen open earlier was that there was no response. Kevin and I looked at it, and this time I was positive I hadn't touched anything. Agreed in silence that something wasn't right. We chose to remain together while we glanced at each other. Elise returned a few minutes later, emerging from the end of the corridor, close to baggage claim, moving carefully as if her eyes were practically dizzy. Her face was pale, and she was deep in contemplation when we hurried up to ask where she had been, and she hardly answered, mumbling something about needing space and air. She sat down after being questioned if she had gone outside, but the doors were still shut and the alarm had not gone off. Covered her legs with her blanket and remained silent. Even Kevin, who never stops talking and didn't push her, something in her face warned us not to following that. Neither of us actually slept. Instead, we sat quietly and watched the minutes creep over the wall clock. Elise refused to give us a look, instead keeping her gaze fixated on the windows as if she was waiting for something to appear outside. Kevin attempted to divert her attention oneself by browsing through his phone, but the Wi-Fi and reception were terrible. I recall getting up one more time to fetch water from the vending machine because it didn't seem to be working anymore. When I noticed someone moving quickly as I turned back toward our small tent and ducked behind one of the distant pillars close to gate 4, I simply strolled back gently and silently. Pretending nothing had occurred, I sat down, but my heart was racing and I couldn't take my eyes off that hallway. We heard it again at about 5:15. First a mild thump and then a dragging sound. Kevin got to his feet after being dragged over the tile, this time snatching one of those airport courtesy poles that are used to rope, he said. It's probably maintenance, more to himself than to me, offlines, but no one left that hallway. The light was so dim that I could not see the end of it, but there was no question back there. Something or someone was moving out of view. The dragging sound abruptly stopped, and we simply waited. There were no sounds or footsteps, just a dense silence that made us feel as though we were underwater. Remained there for more than an hour, hardly moving at first dawn, before the automated doors loudly unlocked. All three of us were startled by a metallic click when the first ground crew member entered, carrying a coffee and asking if everything was okay, when he noticed that we were sitting there as if we hadn't moved all night. I didn't even look up when we gathered, and Kevin nodded before I could say anything, None of us wanted to be the ones to explain why it felt like we were being watched all night, so we kept our belongings to ourselves. Remained hopeful that there would be more tracks on the ground, or that someone would be standing behind the glass, but it was just started. By the soft hum of the morning shift, Elise didn't open up for a few days, and even then, she didn't say anything. She had entered the old service corridor in search of the restroom and believed she noticed someone standing at the. She added that the far end was still as if they were waiting for her, so she turned around and went in the opposite direction. But one by one, the light behind her began to fade out. There were no voices or footsteps, just as she refused to elaborate, saying that the hallway was growing darker more quickly than she could travel, and that we hadn't worked the same staircase. Since I constantly ask for a hotel, even though I occasionally still get assigned to the route, now I would much rather sleep in a roach hotel, even if it meant paying cash, rather than remain confined within that location for another night. Working from home has always been my preference because it allows me to manage the lighting, the temperature, and most importantly, the ground beneath my feet. But when the business made it known that they will be giving a crucial client presentation in Seattle, I couldn't really say no because it was obvious that they wanted to meet with all of the department heads. They urged that I be a salesperson even though I'm a software engineer. I was wearing a suit when I boarded a regional flight out of SF to present the back-end system to the client, pack a tablet with diagrams, and a tense feeling in my chest that doesn't, although the journey was only 2 hours long. I recall how much Dramamine could be fixed. It was overcast during the entire week, and I had hardly slept the night before. Every cough seemed to reverberate off the plane, which was one of those smaller Embraer jets. Walls. I was seated close to the rear wing, where everything is felt more strongly. There were two people to my left, who sat across the aisle watching cartoons as they muttered back and forth over who packed what. Full blast until the flight attendant kindly requested that his mother turn it down. Other than that, nothing stuck out. About halfway through the journey, just as we were crossing into the plane abruptly descended into Oregon airspace, and the trays suddenly popped open as if they were one man in the front really yelled the seatbelt as spring-loaded people gasped. When the sign returned, the flight attendants continued to cling to the backs of the seats or the armrests, but it wasn't a momentary shock as the turbulence persisted 4 seconds or minutes, and the lights flickered once. I saw him 3 rows ahead of the aisle seat after he looked at me twice. Perhaps he had a buzz-cut, a green windbreaker, and a neat shave in his late 30s, giving him the appearance of someone who worked outside. I was more interested in his phone than in him, because he was typing on it. His fingers were moving so quickly that it didn't appear as though he was reading what he had written, and the screen brightness was cranked up high, most likely because to the cabin lights flickering, and I managed to catch a few bits of what he was sending. If we deserve this, please pardon me in a series of messages. Number. He appeared focused and purposeful, other than frightened like the rest of us. I initially attempted to persuade myself that he had been waiting for this moment, almost serene in the midst of the pandemonium. Perhaps he was simply afraid that people would say strange things when they were close to die. But something about the way, instead of reacting to the shaking and looking about like everyone else, he continued to stare straight ahead. To get a closer look, I leaned a little bit into the aisle, being careful not to make it seem obvious. The man didn't react. He just continued to type, sending message after message, and then I noticed that his eyes were fixed on the seat in front of him. Smiled, but it was a brief, insignificant one, as if someone who was simply received confirmation that everything was proceeding as planned. The turbulence subsided 10 minutes later, and the pilot turned on the speaker and attributed it to a storm front moving east. The tone was typically comforting, but it cracked as the cabin returned to an awkward silence at the conclusion, as if even he had been flung. Yet people with a child had quit watching cartoons and was suddenly quieter and more attentive. I continued to focus on the man wearing the green windbreaker, who had stopped texting, even though the quarrelling pair had entirely ceased talking. His hands were folded neatly on top of his phone, which was now in his dark lap screen. He appeared to be patient. We arrived at SeaTac a bit later than expected, while awaiting a verdict, and the captain greeted us and apologized for as soon as the jet hit the ground and the brakes squealed against the runway. Those who were traveling with them at the group sigh that you normally hear after a difficult flight is over. But one man got up as soon as the seat without an overhead bin. He retrieved a tiny black bag from behind the seat in front of him when the belt light went off. Before anyone else had even unclicked their belts and vanished, he swerved his luggage down the short aisle, down the jet bridge with no emotion and no eye contact, as if he were on a mission. I just left and checked to see if anyone else had spotted a woman close by. Her brows went up as if to ask, "What was that?" but remained silent while the other passengers gathered slowly, their bags and averting our gazes, as though we had all secretly decided not to discuss what had just transpired. I looked around the terminal as I entered, almost expecting to see the man being stopped, interrogated, or even merely hurriedly approaching a gate in the green jacket, but he wasn't there. Instead, he had simply disappeared, not even at baggage claim, and I became quite irritated, because there was no reason for someone to behave that way, unless they had already done something or were fleeing from something. I attempted to brush it off later that night at the hotel, telling myself it had only been a difficult journey and the man was perhaps it was just strange or dramatic, but my curiosity kept getting the better of me, so I opened and searched the aircraft number using keywords like incident and passenger in a secret browser tab, but nothing was removed. I looked up the same words I had seen on his phone, and there were no arrests, press stories, or even tweets. "We deserve this. Please pardon me. I regret that I went into the old forum, because it led to a rabbit hole." Some of them utilized those in their scary YouTube rants and manifesto extracts. Identical lines. I began to question whether I had just witnessed someone about to do something genuinely awful, and then changed their minds at the last minute. So I gently brought it up over the coffee break the following morning. Client meeting Paula, a woman who had also been traveling to the flight, along with other passengers, heard the same presentation and turned to face me right away, saying though she didn't see the note, she recalled how quickly he left the plane and stated she found it strange how composed he. I got shivers thinking about how difficult the flight had been, but it wasn't in my imagination. Someone else had witnessed the same thing and experienced the same silence. When my alarm went off, I returned home to San Jose, and a few days later, I reported the airline's customer service was not what I had anticipated doing, but I had to get it. They removed my statement from my chest, but they didn't say much, more than the predetermined, "Thank you for your concern." Nobody asked for the names of the passengers on such brief domestic flights, so I'm not even sure whether they followed up planes until there's a reason. But his face and his level of assurance before we even reached the worst of the turbulence, he seemed to have made peace with something. I haven't flown since maybe it's extreme, but I now drive even to places that need 2 days of travel. Perhaps it was a terrible day, or he was just an odd guy with a twisted sense of humor. But as the lights in that cabin flickered and the plane shook, if it were being torn apart in midair, I heard a man say goodbye to something, not to somebody specifically, and if he decides to change his mind, I'll never know why, yet I consider it frequently, not for any particular reason occurred, but because of what nearly occurred.